Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if the way your life unfolds is actually following a predictable pattern, or if it is just a chaotic mess of random events? Well, some scientists are building a way to test just that. Imagine you are watching a tiny particle bobbing around in water. It is moving in a jerky, unpredictable way, right? That is kind of like a diffusion process. Scientists often use these diffusion models to understand time-based data, like how your mood changes throughout the day or how stock prices fluctuate. But here's the tricky part. Just because data looks a bit random and follows a general trend doesn't mean it's truly explained by a simple diffusion process. There could be other hidden factors at play. This paper is all about creating a test to figure out if a diffusion process is enough to explain your data, or if something else like sudden jumps or unexpected changes is going on. So, what's the big idea behind their test? It all starts with something called the Kramers, Moyle expansion. Don't let the name scare you. Think of it like this. If a process is truly a diffusion process, its behavior can be perfectly described by just the first two terms in a mathematical expansion. Any higher order terms should theoretically be zeroed. But in the real world, when we measure things, especially at specific points in time, we can get little glitches in our data that make these higher order terms look like they're not zero, even if the underlying process is pure diffusion. The researchers realized that the way these higher order terms behave differently between a true diffusion process and a process with extra weirdness could be the key to telling them apart. They propose using the fourth Kramers Moyle coefficient. If a process is purely diffusive, this fourth coefficient should be zero. If it is not, this coefficient will likely be larger. But just looking at this number isn't enough because, as we said, measuring it from real data can be a bit noisy. So, they decided to measure how far this fourth coefficient is from zero, using something called the L2 norm. Think of it as a score that tells you how much your data deviates from what a pure diffusion process would look like. They call this score the kappa statistic. Now, how do they actually test this? This is where it gets clever. They take your actual time series data, estimate its first two Kramers Moyle coefficients, and use those to build a simulated diffusion process. Essentially, they reconstruct what a pure diffusion model would do based on your data's drift and diffusion rates. Then, they generate a whole bunch of these simulated diffusion paths. For each of these simulated paths, they calculate that kappa statistic. This gives them a distribution, a range of kappa values that they would expect if your data were truly just diffusion. They compare the kappa statistic calculated from your actual data to this distribution of expected kappa values. If your data's kappa score is way out in the tail of the expected distribution, meaning it is much higher than what a pure diffusion process would typically produce, they conclude that your data is not sufficiently explained by a simple diffusion model. It suggests there are other factors like sudden jumps or more complex changes influencing the data. They ran a bunch of computer simulations to see how well their test worked. They created data that was purely diffusive and data that had diffusion plus jumps. And the results were pretty good. When the data was truly just diffusion, their test usually said, yep, looks like diffusion. But when they added jumps, the test was also pretty good at saying, nope. Something else is going on here. They found that changing a certain setting called the quantile threshold could make the test more or less sensitive. A more conservative setting meant it was less likely to call something non-diffusive, while a more liberal setting meant it was quicker to reject the idea of pure diffusion. This is where the research gets really interesting. They applied their test to real-world data. First, they looked at people's self-reported emotional arousal levels from a mobile health study. For one participant, their emotional journey seemed to follow a smooth, diffusive path. But for another participant, their arousal levels had these sharp ups and downs, especially early on, which the test flagged as not purely diffusive. This makes sense, right? Our emotions can have gradual shifts, but also sudden plunges or spikes because of specific events. Then, they looked at EEG data from epilepsy patients. They analyzed a few segments of brain activity. One segment looked very much like a predictable diffusion process, but two other segments showed clear periodic jumps. This is pretty significant because some previous research on epilepsy assumed simple diffusion models. The fact that their test flags these EEG segments as containing more than just diffusion fits with newer ideas that complex brain activity, like epilepsy, might involve jump-like events. So, what does this all mean? This test gives us a powerful new tool. It helps us move beyond simply assuming our data is diffusive just because it is a bit messy. It allows us to be more precise about whether a simple diffusion model is sufficient to capture the dynamics of a time series. If the test rejects diffusion, It is a strong signal that we need to look for other explanations like sudden changes, external influences, or perhaps even time-dependent effects that aren't captured by basic diffusion. One limitation they mention is that their current method works best for diffusion, where the underlying rates of change don't explicitly depend on time itself, but only on the current state, extending it to cases where the diffusion or drift rates change over time would require even more advanced math and more data. But the core idea holds. By looking at these higher-order effects, we can get a clearer picture of the true nature of the underlying process. Overall, this research is super exciting. It gives us a way to objectively assess if our assumptions about data being purely diffusive are correct. It's like having a scientific way to ask, is this just random bouncing around, or is there something more structured, maybe even dramatic, happening here? This could be super useful in everything from understanding human behavior and emotions to analyzing brain activity and even financial markets. It really highlights how important it is to check our model assumptions carefully, because the reality might be more complex and interesting than we initially thought. What do you all think? Does this make you rethink how you look at your own data, whether it is personal mood tracking or something more complex? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more science explained, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the mysteries of the mind and beyond. Thanks for watching.